when victory became chaos. May 8, 1945. London erupts in jubilation. 1,000,000 souls pour into the streets, their voices rising in a deafening roar of triumph. 6 years of darkness, death, and desperation are finally over. The Nazi scourge has been crushed. Europe is free. British and American forces, having fought with unparalleled courage from the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Berlin, have secured the greatest military victory in human history. But what should have been the most glorious day in a generation would become, for some, their last. Picture this: crowds so thick you can barely breathe, people fainting by the dozens, tram cars set ablaze, shops looted, and in the chaos, people dying on the very day they thought they were finally safe. This is the story they don't tell you about VE Day. This is the story of how the greatest celebration turned into unexpected tragedy. If you want to understand what really happened when Britain celebrated victory over tyranny, you need to hear this story. And believe me, by the end, you'll see VE Day in a completely different light. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this channel brings you the untold stories of British heroism that shaped our world. Let's start at the beginning. For 6 long years, Britain had endured what no nation should ever have to face. From September 1939, when Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's solemn voice crackled through radios across the nation, announcing that Britain was at war with Germany, the British people had shown extraordinary resilience. They had survived the Blitz, night after night of German bombers raining death from the skies. In September 1940 alone, 5,300 tons of high explosives fell on London in just 24 nights. The Luftwaffe had tried to break British spirit, to prepare the way for a Nazi invasion, but Britain held firm. Every morning, Londoners emerged from underground stations and shelters, dusted themselves off, and carried on. British soldiers, sailors, and airmen had fought with legendary courage on every front. At Dunkirk in 1940, when disaster loomed and 400,000 Allied troops were trapped on French beaches with the Wehrmacht closing in, the Royal Navy and an armada of civilian boats, fishermen, pleasure craft, even paddle steamers, crossed the Channel under constant bombardment to rescue the British Expeditionary Force. It was a defeat transformed into a miracle by British determination. In North Africa, Field Marshal Montgomery's 8th Army had battled through desert heat and sandstorms to defeat Rommel's Afrika Korps at Al Alamein in 1942. Churchill would later call it the end of the beginning. British troops showed the world that the Nazi war machine could be beaten. D-Day, June 6, 1944, the day that British, American, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. British soldiers waded through withering machine gun fire on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. Thousands fell, but the survivors pushed forward. They liberated France, village by village, town by town. They crossed into Belgium and Holland. By spring 1945, they were in Germany itself, closing the noose around Hitler's crumbling Reich. And the British people at home? They had sacrificed everything. Rationing meant families survived on meager portions of meat, eggs, and butter. Clothing required coupons. Petrol was precious. Children grew up knowing nothing but war. Thousands of women had joined the workforce, building the Spitfires and Lancasters that ruled the skies, manufacturing the ammunition that armed the troops. Britain had earned its victory through blood, sweat, and tears. Churchill's famous words. And now, finally, that victory was at hand. By late April 1945, everyone knew the end was coming. Allied and Soviet forces were converging on Berlin. Hitler was trapped in his bunker like a cornered rat. The question wasn't if Germany would surrender, but when. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler, the architect of genocide, the man whose megalomania had plunged the world into the deadliest conflict in human history, took the coward's way out. He shot himself in his underground bunker as Soviet shells rained down on the burning ruins of Berlin above. His 1,000-year Reich lay in smoking rubble after just 12 years. A week later, on May 7, 1945, at 2:41 a.m. in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender on behalf of what remained of the German High Command. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces and the architect of D-Day, witnessed the historic moment. The surrender would take effect at 11:01 p.m. on May 8th. Word spread like wildfire. Even before the official announcement, people in Britain sensed something was happening. Newspapers prepared special editions. Radio announcers stood ready. On the evening of May 7th, the BBC interrupted regular programming with a newsflash. The next day would be a national holiday. Victory in Europe Day. VE Day. The British people had been waiting for this moment for 6 years. Now, it was here. May 8, 1945 dawned bright and warm over London. It was a Tuesday, but nobody was going to work. This was Britain's day to celebrate. People poured out of their homes wearing red, white, and blue. Union Jack flags appeared everywhere, hanging from windows, draped over balconies, waving from every lamppost. The Board of Trade had announced that people could purchase bunting without using precious ration coupons, and Londoners had seized the opportunity. At 3 p.m., Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the man who had refused to surrender when Britain stood alone in 1940, who had rallied the nation with his magnificent oratory, who had forged the alliance with America and the Soviet Union, broadcast to the nation from 10 Downing Street.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe, Churchill announced in his famous gravelly voice. The German war is therefore at an end. God bless you all. This is your victory. And the crowds gathered outside roared back, "No, it is yours." More than 1 million people filled the streets of London. In Trafalgar Square, crowds were so thick you couldn't see the pavement. They climbed on the stone lions at the base of Nelson's Column. They waded into the fountains, splashing and laughing. British sailors kissed their girlfriends in the water while thousands cheered. At Buckingham Palace, nearly 100,000 people gathered, all of them wanting to see their king and queen. King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, and the 2 princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, appeared on the balcony again and again. 8 times they came out to wave to the adoring crowds below. Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth II, was just 19 years old. She had served in the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service as a driver and mechanic, a real contribution to the war effort. That night, she and Princess Margaret did something unprecedented. They asked their father's permission to slip out of the palace incognito and join the celebrations on the streets of London. "I remember we were terrified of being recognized," Elizabeth would later recall. "I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall, all of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief. I think it was one of the most memorable nights of my life." Up and down the country, street parties erupted. Long tables appeared on residential streets covered with whatever food rationing would allow. Children sat down to sandwiches and cakes, while adults danced in the streets. Bonfires were lit, dance halls opened their doors, pubs filled to bursting and quickly ran out of beer despite the Ministry of Food's assurances to Churchill that supplies would be sufficient. At St. Paul's Cathedral, that magnificent dome that had survived the Blitz, that had become a symbol of British endurance, Thanksgiving services ran one after another, 10 in total, each one packed with thousands giving thanks for peace. The scene was similar across the Allied world. In New York's Times Square, 15,000 police officers struggled to control crowds of 250,000 celebrating Americans. In Paris, people packed the Champs-Élysées from the Place de la Concorde to the Arc de Triomphe. In Moscow's Red Square, joyous crowds celebrated the defeat of the fascist invasion that had cost the Soviet Union so dearly. It was a moment of pure, unrestrained joy. After 6 years of fear, sacrifice, and death, the people of Britain and her allies were finally, gloriously free. But beneath the celebration, something else was brewing, something that would turn triumph into tragedy. Here's what most people don't realize about VE Day. Not everyone was celebrating. Betty Clay, a 24-year-old physiotherapist working in London, wrote about her experiences that night. She and her friends made their way through the crowds to Buckingham Palace. It was a sultry evening, she recorded in her diary. I've never seen so many women faint in such rapid succession. It was a regular battlefield. An ambulance worker near her commented, "Oh, this is just hopeless. It beats cup finals at Wembley." The crowds were so dense, so packed together, that people were collapsing from heat and crush injuries. The atmosphere was suffocating. If you've ever been in a massive crowd where you can't move your arms, where you're carried along by the press of bodies around you, that was VE Day in central London. Multiply that by the emotion, the alcohol, the 6 years of pent-up tension suddenly released, and you begin to understand how dangerous it became. And there was something else. For all the joy, there was also profound grief. Walking through those celebrating crowds were widows who had lost husbands at sea or in the skies over Germany. There were parents who would never see their sons again, young men blown apart on the beaches of Normandy, burned alive in tanks in the deserts of North Africa, lost when their bombers were shot down over Berlin. Churches were full not just with Thanksgiving services, but with people who couldn't face the public celebrations. They sat quietly, remembering loved ones who would never come home. The noise and jubilation were too much to bear. In small villages across Britain, the celebrations were more subdued. As one elderly woman later recalled, there was not much celebration in small villages because people could clearly see who was missing, and therefore who had lost their lives in the war. But the real darkness, the tragedy that would stain VE Day, was yet to come. And it would happen in the most unexpected place, not in London, but in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, a city that had served as the western terminal for the vital North Atlantic convoys, where 25,000 Allied servicemen were stationed, where British and Canadian sailors had fought the Battle of the Atlantic against German U-boats for 6 long years. Halifax was about to explode. What happened in Halifax over the next 248 hours would shock the Allied world and result in multiple deaths, hundreds of arrests, and millions of dollars in damage. It would expose deep tensions between military and civilian populations that had been building throughout the war. And it would show that even on the day of greatest triumph, chaos and tragedy were never far away. In Part 2, we'll take you into the heart of the Halifax riots, the looting, the violence, the fires, and the deaths. We'll show you how poor planning, alcohol, and years of resentment turned what should have been celebration into catastrophe. You won't want to miss it. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. Hit that like button if you're learning something new about VE Day, and drop a comment below. Did you know about the dark side of VE Day celebrations? Let me know. The story continues in Part 2.
When the party turned to riot. Welcome back to Part 2 of our investigation into the dark side of VE Day, the celebration that turned tragic. If you haven't watched Part 1, stop right now and go watch it. You need the full context of what happened on May 8, 1945 to understand why one of history's greatest days of triumph became, for some, a nightmare. In Part 1, we covered the jubilation that swept through London and Allied cities worldwide when Germany surrendered. We saw Princess Elizabeth dancing incognito through the streets. We heard Churchill's triumphant announcement. We felt the pure joy of a world finally free from Nazi tyranny. But we also saw the warning signs. The fainting women crushed in the crowds outside Buckingham Palace, the widows unable to celebrate, the simmering tensions in overcrowded military port cities where servicemen and civilians had been rubbing shoulders, sometimes badly, for 6 long years. Now, we're going to show you what happened when those tensions exploded. This is the story of the Halifax VE Day riots. 3 deaths, hundreds of arrests, millions in damage, and a stain on the Allied victory that authorities tried desperately to cover up. And if you think that was the only tragedy, stay with me. We'll also uncover other deaths and accidents from VE Day that history has quietly forgotten. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you're loving these deep dives into British military history. Let's travel across the Atlantic to Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. If you're not familiar with Halifax's role in World War II, you need to understand just how crucial this city was to Allied victory. Halifax was the most important port in the world for the Battle of the Atlantic, Britain's lifeline. Every convoy carrying desperately needed supplies from North America to Britain had to pass through Halifax. Food, ammunition, weapons, aircraft, fuel, troops, everything that kept Britain fighting came through this port. German U-boats prowled the North Atlantic, hunting these convoys like wolves. Allied sailors, particularly the Royal Canadian Navy, fought a brutal, unglamorous war protecting these supply ships. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not in heroic charges, but in long, cold, terrifying voyages where death could come at any moment from a torpedo in the dark. Halifax was the nerve center of this operation, and it had paid a heavy price. Before the war, Halifax was a small, conservative maritime city of about 70,000 people. By 1945, its population had nearly doubled. An additional 65,000 people, mostly military personnel, had flooded in. There were 18,000 Royal Canadian Navy sailors alone stationed in and around Halifax, plus thousands more Army and Air Force personnel. The city's infrastructure simply couldn't cope. Restaurants had hour-long waits, movie theaters had queues around the block, housing was desperately scarce, and some landlords exploited servicemen by charging extortionate rents. There were no legal places for servicemen to drink alcohol except the wet canteens on their bases. Government liquor stores were off-limits to them, and they weren't allowed to keep alcohol in barracks. This created a thriving black market of illegal drinking establishments and brothels. It also created resentment. Sailors felt the civilian population was profiteering from the war while looking down on the men who were risking their lives. Civilians complained that drunken sailors vandalized property on paydays and treated their city with contempt. The Royal Commission that later investigated the riots noted something chilling. Vandalism, including the breaking of plate glass windows and the tearing down of awnings and street signs, mostly by intoxicated naval ratings on paydays, was a usual and expected occurrence in wartime Halifax. A usual and expected occurrence. That's how normalized the tension had become. Sailors called Halifax slackers. There were whispered threats that when the war ended, Halifax would get what was coming to it.
Municipal and military officials knew trouble was brewing. They'd begun planning for VE Day celebrations as early as September 1944. They organized Thanksgiving services, parades, fireworks, street festivals, anything to keep people occupied and peaceful. But in a catastrophic decision, they decided to close everything on VE Day itself. Liquor stores closed. Restaurants closed. Movie theaters closed. Even the streetcars would stop running to discourage sailors from going downtown. The theory was that keeping everything shut would prevent trouble. The reality? It guaranteed chaos. News of Germany's surrender broke on the evening of May 7th. Halifax erupted in spontaneous celebration. Sailors poured out of their barracks and into the city center. Civilians joined them. By late evening, more than 12,000 people filled downtown Halifax. And there was nothing for them to do. Everything was shut. Rear Admiral Leonard Murray, the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy's North Atlantic operations, a genuine war hero who had overseen the victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, made a fatal decision. Against the advice of his senior officers, he issued open gangway orders. This meant more than 9,000 sailors were allowed to leave their bases for the night, with only a mild admonition that their celebration should be joyful without being destructive or distasteful. By midnight, downtown Halifax was packed. Thousands of young men, pumped full of adrenaline and emotion after 6 years of war, with nowhere to go and nothing to do. Someone smashed a window. Then another. Then a streetcar was set ablaze. The crowd watched it burn, cheering. A police paddy wagon tried to intervene. The mob surrounded it, pushed it down a street, and shoved it into Halifax Harbor. More cheering.
Liquor stores became the primary target. Sailors and civilians alike smashed through windows and doors, grabbing every bottle they could carry. Within hours, they'd looted Halifax's liquor stores dry. Dorothy Grant was just 10 years old, living in an apartment on Barrington Street with her family. Looking out from their third-floor window, she watched the chaos unfold below. It was terrifying, she would recall 75 years later. You get this steady stream of people walking by, drunk, carrying stolen goods. My parents wouldn't let us go outside. By dawn on May 8th, official VE Day, downtown Halifax looked like it had been bombed. Broken glass covered the streets. Burned-out streetcars sat abandoned. Shop windows gaped empty. The Toronto Star would report that Halifax's business district looked like London after a blitz. But the worst was yet to come. You'd think after a night of rioting, authorities would crack down. You'd think Admiral Murray would cancel shore leave and confine his sailors to barracks. You'd be wrong. Murray didn't learn about the previous night's events until 9:45 a.m. when he read about them in the newspapers. He assumed the papers were exaggerating and blaming his sailors for civilian crimes. He believed only about 200 of his men had participated, egged on by civilian bootleggers. So he took no action. Another 9,500 sailors were allowed to go ashore on May 8th for the official VE Day celebrations. The wet canteen at HMSC Stadacona, the naval base, ran out of liquor early in the day. Thousands of sailors looking for alcohol to celebrate headed into town. They descended on the Alexander Keith's brewery. Guards tried to stop them but were overwhelmed. Sailors and civilians stormed inside and carried out case after case of beer. Then they turned their attention to the rest of downtown Halifax. What followed was systematic looting on a scale Canada had never seen. Jewelry stores, furniture stores, clothing shops, anything that wasn't nailed down was taken. People walked past Dorothy Grant's apartment carrying everything imaginable. My favorite story, Grant recalled, is that a man went by and he dropped 2 shoes. They're quite nice, and my father waited till there was no one around, and he said, "Go get them." They were 2 left feet, so we couldn't use them. The mob took mannequins from department stores. Can you imagine the surreal sight of looters walking through the streets carrying life-size mannequins? By the time Murray and Butler finally drove through the city in a sound truck, ordering everyone home and imposing a curfew, the damage was done. The final toll was staggering. 3 men dead, 363 arrested, 654 businesses damaged, 207 establishments looted. The federal government would eventually pay out over $1 million, nearly $20 million in today's money.
Let's talk about those 3 deaths, because each one tells a tragic story. 2 of the dead were sailors who died from alcohol poisoning. They drank so much looted liquor so quickly that their bodies simply shut down. These were young men, teenagers really, who had survived the Battle of the Atlantic, who had faced German torpedoes and survived, only to die drinking stolen alcohol on the day they should have been celebrating survival. The 3rd death remains mysterious. Official reports list it as a possible murder that occurred during the rioting. The victim was never fully identified in public records. 75 years later, we still don't know exactly what happened to him. Was he killed in a fight? Beaten by the mob? Caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? The chaos was so complete that even this death got lost in the mayhem. Think about that. 3 young men who should have lived long, happy lives, who had survived a world war, died on VE Day in Halifax. Their families got the news not that their sons were coming home, but that they had died in rioting on the day of victory. The Canadian government moved quickly to investigate. A royal commission led by Justice Roy Kellogg was appointed on May 10th, just 2 days after the riots ended. The commission's report laid the blame squarely on Admiral Leonard Murray. Kellogg wrote, "The disorders which actually occurred on May 7 and 8 owe their origin, in my opinion, to failure on the part of the Naval Command in Halifax to plan for their personnel." Murray, a man who had defended Canada and the United Kingdom throughout the Battle of the Atlantic, was scapegoated.
He had been recommended for promotion to vice admiral and a prestigious posting. After the Kellogg report, that recommendation was quietly withdrawn. In a letter dated September 6, 1945, the government informed Murray there was no suitable appointment for him. Rather than fight the decision, Murray resigned from the Navy entirely. He said, "I thought it best to withdraw quietly. For the good of the service, I went into voluntary exile." He left Canada for England at the end of September 1945. He would rarely return to his homeland. When he died, peacefully in his sleep in 1971, Canadian newspapers barely noticed. Only small blurbs appeared on inside pages. In recent decades, historians have worked to rehabilitate Murray's reputation. Buildings have been named after him. He's been recognized for his wartime service. But the stigma of the Halifax riots followed him to his grave. Was Murray to blame? Partially, yes. His decision to grant shore leave was catastrophic. But the real blame lay deeper. In the years of tension between servicemen and civilians, in the poor planning by municipal officials, in the decision to close everything on VE Day, in a system that treated young servicemen as problems to be managed rather than heroes to be celebrated. The Halifax riots exposed the dark underbelly of wartime society, and they showed that even on the day of greatest triumph, human nature could turn celebration into tragedy. But Halifax wasn't the only place where VE Day turned tragic. Let me tell you about some other deaths that history has largely forgotten. Remember Betty Clay, the young physiotherapist who described women fainting outside Buckingham Palace? Betty survived VE Day. She later went to India to work in military hospitals. On October 2, 1946, she was killed in a landslide while walking in the hills around Nainital. She had survived 6 years of war in London, survived the Blitz, survived VE Day, only to die in a peacetime accident. She was just 25 years old. In occupied Germany, British soldiers continued to die even after the war officially ended. Private Sidney Harris of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment had survived being wounded on D-Day. He recovered from those injuries only to be killed in a traffic accident on a quiet German street in the days after VE Day. Another British soldier, newly engaged to be married, celebrated VE Day by diving into a German lake. He drowned. His fiancée received the news that her future husband, who had survived combat, had died in a moment of joyful celebration.
In Osnabrück, Germany, 30-year-old Norman Sanford died after drinking illegal schnapps at a VE Day party. His grave in Münster Heath Cemetery includes a dedication from Bertha and baby Keith, his wife and 15-month-old son who would grow up never knowing his father. And what about the German prisoners of war held in Britain? They also continued to die in the months and years after VE Day. The British government kept POWs until summer 1948, using them as labor. Many died in accidents. In Moray, Scotland, 22-year-old Albert Berner was riding in the back of a lorry with 19 other German POWs when the vehicle struck a telegraph pole. Berner fell backward onto the road, fracturing his skull. He died 5 hours later. In Norfolk, 5 German prisoners were killed when 2 lorries collided. In Gloucestershire, another German prisoner died after being crushed by a truck. In the deadliest incident, 10 Germans and 2 British soldiers died in 1947 when a passenger train struck an army lorry at a level crossing in Burton Hagness. In Plymouth, a group of German POWs tried to brew their own alcohol for a New Year's celebration in 1947. They mixed antifreeze and wood. Waldemar Burgau from Hamburg drank half a bottle of this lethal cocktail and quickly collapsed. He died of poisoning in hospital. These men were the enemy, yes, but they were also young men far from home who had fought for a regime most of them never truly believed in, who had been captured and held for years, and who died in accidents that had nothing to do with combat. Every death is a tragedy. Every death represents a family that never saw their loved one come home. Here's the truth about VE Day that most people don't want to acknowledge. Victory is never clean. Triumph is never pure. Even on the day we defeated the greatest evil of the 20th century, people died in stupid, preventable, tragic ways. They died from drinking too much. They died in riots. They died in crowd crushes. They died in traffic accidents. They died celebrating. They died from mistakes and bad luck and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And for every person who died, there were families left behind. Mothers who had spent 6 years terrified their sons would be killed in combat, only to lose them on the day the war ended. Wives who had waited faithfully, only to become widows at the moment of victory. Children who would grow up never knowing their fathers. The Halifax riots, the deaths in London's crowds, the accidents in Germany, these aren't stories that fit comfortably into our narrative of VE Day. We want VE Day to be pure triumph. We want to remember the jubilation, the flag waving, Churchill on the balcony, the princesses in the crowd, the spontaneous parties, the joy. And those things happened. They were real and important and beautiful. But so were the tragedies. And ignoring them does a disservice to the people who lived through them. In Part 3, our final installment, we're going to bring the story home. We'll explore how British and American authorities tried to manage the aftermath, how they learned lessons that would apply to future victories, and what VE Day really teaches us about human nature in moments of triumph. We'll also reveal one more shocking story about VE Day that almost resulted in catastrophe on the scale of the Halifax explosion of 1917. Trust me, you won't believe what nearly happened in the weeks after VE Day. Make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on so you don't miss the final part of this incredible story. Drop a like if you're learning something new about history, and comment below what surprises you most about the dark side of VE Day. The final chapter awaits in Part 3.
Welcome to Part 3, the final chapter of our journey into the untold tragedy of VE Day. If you're just joining us now, you absolutely must go back and watch Parts 1 and 2. This is a story that builds, and you need the full context to understand what we're about to reveal. In Part 1, we showed you the jubilation. 1 million people in London streets, Princess Elizabeth dancing incognito, Churchill declaring victory, the world finally free from Nazi tyranny after 6 years of blood and sacrifice. In Part 2, we descended into the chaos. The Halifax riots that killed 3 men and caused millions in damage, the crowd crushes in London, the British soldiers dying in traffic accidents in occupied Germany, the German POWs killed in preventable mishaps. Death and tragedy on the day that was supposed to represent ultimate triumph. Now, in this final part, we're going to reveal something even more shocking. Something that could have killed thousands more people in Halifax. We're going to show you how authorities learned from these tragedies and applied those lessons to VJ Day just 3 months later. And we're going to explore what VE Day really teaches us about human nature, victory, and the price of freedom. This is powerful stuff. If you've made it this far in the series, thank you for having the courage to see history as it really was, messy, complicated, tragic, and triumphant, all at once. Let's finish this story the right way. Hit that subscribe button because this channel is dedicated to telling you the truth about British and Allied military history, even when that truth is uncomfortable. 2 months after the VE Day riots, Halifax nearly experienced a catastrophe that would have made the riots look like a minor incident. On July 18, 1945, at late afternoon, the naval magazine on the shores of Bedford Basin caught fire. If you know anything about Halifax history, alarm bells should be going off in your head right now. Let me explain why. In December 1917, during World War I, Halifax experienced the largest man-made explosion before the atomic bomb. A French cargo ship loaded with wartime explosives collided with another vessel in Halifax Harbor. The resulting explosion killed approximately 2,000 people instantly and injured 9,000 more. It flattened entire neighborhoods. The blast was so powerful, it created a tsunami in the harbor. 28 years later, with that disaster still burned into Halifax's collective memory, the naval magazine, containing massive stockpiles of ammunition and explosives, was on fire. For 12 hours, the air and ground trembled with exploding ammunition. Shells and charges detonated one after another in a horrifying symphony of destruction. The north ends of both Dartmouth and Halifax emptied as thousands of citizens fled in terror, waiting for the big one that would repeat the 1917 catastrophe. Imagine the scene. It's barely 2 months since the VE Day riots devastated downtown. The city is still recovering, still picking up pieces, still dealing with the trauma. And now this, a threat of annihilation that could kill thousands. But here's where British and Allied heroism shines through the darkness. Local firemen and Royal Canadian Navy personnel rushed toward the danger, not away from it. While civilians fled, these brave men fought the fire through the night, knowing that one wrong move, one unlucky spark reaching the wrong cache of ammunition, could vaporize them. They worked through the explosions. They felt the ground shake beneath their feet with each detonation. They pressed forward. By dawn, on July 19th, the explosions had finally died away. The disaster had been contained. Not a single person had died. The firefighters and naval personnel had saved Halifax from potential devastation that could have killed thousands. Think about the courage that took. These were men who had survived 6 years of war, who had just celebrated victory, who could have said, "Enough, I've done my part." But when their city needed them most, they ran toward the fire. This is the British and Allied spirit at its finest. When disaster strikes, when everything seems lost, there are always heroes willing to stand in the breach. The Halifax riots and the near disaster at the magazine taught authorities crucial lessons. When Japan surrendered on August 14, 1945, Victory over Japan Day, or VJ Day, officials across the Allied world were determined not to repeat the mistakes of VE Day. In Halifax, there would be no more open gangway. Shore leave was carefully controlled. Police stations didn't close, they stayed open with regulated hours. Restaurants and entertainment venues remained operational to give people something to do. Police presence was tripled. The VJ Day celebrations in Halifax were jubilant but peaceful. No riots, no looting, no deaths. The lessons had been learned in the hardest way possible, but they had been learned. In London, too, VJ Day was more controlled than VE Day. Authorities had seen the crowd crushes, the fainting women, the chaos outside Buckingham Palace. They implemented better crowd management. Medical personnel were stationed throughout central London. Water stations were set up. The celebrations were joyous, but safer.
Across America, similar lessons applied. After the chaos in Halifax had made international headlines, U.S. cities planned their VJ Day celebrations with much greater care. In some cities, celebrations were actually more subdued, with President Truman encouraging Americans to remain focused on rebuilding and healing. This is one of the positive legacies of the VE Day tragedies. The lives lost, the injuries sustained, the chaos endured. They weren't entirely in vain. They taught authorities how to manage mass celebrations without descending into anarchy. But there's a deeper lesson here, one that goes beyond crowd management and shore leave policies. Here's what VE Day really teaches us. Victory is complicated. We want our historical moments to be clean. We want VE Day to be purely joyous, flags waving, crowds cheering, heroes returning home to ticker-tape parades. We want D-Day to be purely heroic, brave soldiers storming beaches to liberate Europe. We want World War II to be purely righteous, good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny. And in the big picture, those things are true. The Allied victory over Nazi Germany was righteous. British and American soldiers were heroes. D-Day was one of the most important military operations in history. VE Day represented the triumph of freedom over fascism.
But zoom in on individual moments, individual lives, and it gets messy. On VE Day, some people celebrated while others mourned. Some danced in the streets, while others sat quietly in churches, unable to face the noise. Some risked their lives fighting fires at the Naval Magazine, while others looted shops in Halifax. Some died from drinking too much, while others died from being crushed in crowds. Victory contained all of these contradictions. It was joyous and tragic, triumphant and heartbreaking, heroic and shameful, all at the same time. And that's actually more profound than the simple story we usually tell. Think about what the British people had endured. 6 years of total war, the Blitz, rationing, separation from loved ones, the constant fear that someone you cared about wouldn't come home, the bombing raids that could kill you in your sleep, the V-1 and V-2 rockets that fell from the sky without warning right up until March 1945. When that pressure was finally released, when Germany surrendered and people realized they were actually going to survive, that their children would grow up in peace, that the nightmare was finally over, the emotional release was overwhelming. Some people expressed it through pure joy, others through drunken chaos, others through quiet grief, others through numbness and exhaustion. One witness described the crowds in London on VE Day as having an atmosphere of infinite goodwill and renewed pleasure in life. Another described it as a regular battlefield with women fainting left and right. Both were true. Both were VE Day. Here's something else worth remembering. The war didn't really end on VE Day. British forces continued fighting in Burma and the Pacific. Thousands of British and Allied soldiers were still prisoners of war in Japanese camps, enduring brutal conditions. The atomic bombs hadn't yet fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The final surrender of Japan was still 3 months away. And even after VJ Day, even after Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the war's effects continued. Rationing in Britain didn't end in 1945. Clothing rationing continued until 1949. Petrol rationing, get this, didn't end until 1950, 9 years after VE Day. British people were still experiencing wartime privation nearly a decade after victory. Britain was also virtually bankrupt. The war had cost everything. American loans through the Lend-Lease program kept Britain afloat, but the terms were harsh. Britain wouldn't finish paying off its World War II debt to the United States until 2006, 61 years after VE Day. And the empire was crumbling. India would gain independence in 1947. The sun was setting on the British Empire that had once spanned a quarter of the globe. And the human toll. Britain lost 383,600 military personnel and 67,100 civilians. Across all combatant nations, 45 to 60 million people died, the deadliest conflict in human history. Each one of those numbers represents a person. A son, a daughter, a father, a mother, a brother, a sister. A person with hopes and dreams and people who loved them. A person who died fighting for freedom or caught in the crossfire of others fighting. VE Day was the day we celebrated victory over evil, but it was also the day we began to truly count the cost of that victory. So what do we take from all of this? What does the tragedy of VE Day teach us 80 years later? First, it teaches us to remember the complexity. Victory wasn't just parades and celebrations, it was also chaos and death and grief and exhaustion. Holding both truths simultaneously, the triumph and the tragedy, gives us a more complete, more honest understanding of history.
Second, it teaches us about human nature. Put tens of thousands of people under extreme pressure for 6 years, then suddenly release that pressure, and things will get messy. Some people will respond with joy, others with violence, others with grief, others with numbness. That's not a failure of character. It's human nature under unprecedented circumstances. Third, it teaches us that even in chaos, there are heroes. The firefighters who saved Halifax from the magazine explosion. The ambulance workers who treated fainting women outside Buckingham Palace. The widows who bore their grief with quiet dignity while others celebrated. The servicemen who maintained discipline even when others didn't.
Heroism isn't just charging machine gun nests. Sometimes it's doing your duty when everything is falling apart around you. Fourth, it teaches us to honor all the victims. Not just the soldiers who died in combat, but also the sailors who died in the Halifax riots, the young women crushed in London's crowds, the pilots who survived the war only to die in peacetime accidents. They all paid a price for victory. And finally, it teaches us that freedom is never free. That cliché is actually profound. The freedom we enjoy today, to criticize our governments, to practice our religions, to speak our minds, to live without fear of jackbooted thugs kicking down our doors in the middle of the night, that freedom was purchased with the blood of British, American, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, French, and other Allied servicemen and women. It was purchased by the merchant sailors who braved U-boat attacks to keep Britain supplied, by the factory workers who built the weapons, by the codebreakers at Bletchley Park who cracked Enigma, by the pilots who flew into flak-filled skies over Germany, by the infantrymen who waded through machine gun fire on Normandy beaches. And yes, by the people who died on VE Day itself. Tragic reminders that even in victory, freedom exacts a cost. Here's my final thought for you. VE Day wasn't the end of the story. It was a chapter, an important chapter, maybe the most important chapter, but not the end. The men and women who celebrated on May 8, 1945, went on to rebuild Europe. They created the post-war order that gave us 70 years of peace in Western Europe, unprecedented in European history. They built the institutions that prevented World War III. They raised children and told them stories about the war, keeping the memory alive. Many of them struggled with what we now call PTSD. They had nightmares about combat. They woke up in cold sweats back in the bomber over Berlin, or in the tank in North Africa, or on the beach at Normandy. They bore psychological scars that never fully healed. But they carried on. They lived. They built. They created the world we inherited. And in Halifax, even after the riots and the near disaster at the magazine, the city carried on too. It rebuilt. It honored both its civilian victims and its military heroes. Today, you can visit memorials to the servicemen who fought the Battle of the Atlantic. You can walk the streets that were once filled with rioters, now peaceful and prosperous. Admiral Leonard Murray was eventually rehabilitated. Buildings were named after him. His contributions to the Battle of the Atlantic were recognized. The Halifax riots, while not forgotten, became understood in their proper context. Not as his personal failure, but as the result of systemic problems that boiled over on the worst possible day. And even Betty Clay, the young physiotherapist who died in that landslide in India, is remembered. Her letters and diaries are preserved in the British Library, giving us a window into what VE Day was really like for ordinary people. History remembers. Not just the triumph, but also the tragedy. Not just the celebrations, but also the costs. Not just the public narrative, but also the private stories. That's what we've tried to do in this three-part series, to remember it all, to tell you the full story of VE Day, the glorious and the shameful, the heroic and the tragic, the public celebrations and the private griefs. Thank you for sticking with me through this journey. I know it's not the feel-good VE Day story you might have expected, but I believe it's important to see history clearly even when it's complicated and uncomfortable. If you've learned something from this series, if it's changed how you think about VE Day or World War II or victory itself, do me a favor, subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, leave a comment telling me what stood out to you most. Your engagement helps us reach more people who want to understand the real stories behind British and Allied military history. And here's what I want you to do next. Think about the veterans you know or knew. Maybe it's a grandfather who served. Maybe it's an elderly neighbor with photos on the wall from their military days. Maybe it's just someone you read about. Remember that they carried experiences we can barely imagine. They saw things we'll never fully understand. They paid prices, physical, psychological, emotional, that we can never fully repay. The least we can do is remember them honestly. Not as sanitized heroes in old war movies, but as real human beings who experienced triumph and tragedy, who showed courage and sometimes faltered, who were simultaneously brave and scared, noble and flawed, victorious and scarred. That's the real legacy of VE Day. Not just that we won, but what it cost to win, and what we did with the peace that victory purchased. By the way, if you enjoyed this series, you're going to love our next deep dive. We're investigating the story of Operation Mincemeat, the most audacious British intelligence deception of World War II, involving a corpse, false documents, and a plan so crazy it might just have saved thousands of D-Day lives. That series drops next week, so make sure you're subscribed. Until then, remember the heroes, remember the costs, remember that freedom is never free. And never forget, on May 8, 1945, the world became a little bit freer, a little bit safer, a little bit more hopeful, because British, American, Canadian, and Allied servicemen and women had the courage to stand against tyranny and say, no more. They paid the price so we wouldn't have to. Let's make sure their sacrifice meant something. If you learned something new today, please subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment with your thoughts. See you in the next video.